last thing I remember before the world dissolved into white was the clock on the dash reading 2:17 a.m., a time that has since become a scar on my consciousness. I had navigated the winding, tree-choked back roads between the nowhere diner I worked at and the empty house I slept in for 3 years, a commute so monotonous it had worn a groove in my soul as deep as the ruts in the asphalt. But that night, the groove ruptured. The fog didn't just appear, it was birthed. One moment, the road was clear under a bruised sky. The next, a wall of vapor so thick and sudden it felt intentional, as if the landscape itself had exhaled a secret meant only for me. My headlights, once piercing tools of navigation, became useless, their beams reflecting back in a solid, swirling mass that transformed my windshield into a static-filled screen. I was sealed in a moving tomb, the familiar woods and fences erased, the only sound the frantic swish of my wipers and the too loud hum of my own dread. This was not weather, it was a visitation. And then the light, a single, pulsating ember of deep crimson, hanging in the void to my right. It matched my speed with an impossible, mocking precision. My mind, scrambling for the anchor of rationality, offered desperate suggestions. A distant radio tower, a plane's beacon, a trick of the tired eye. But this light had a sentient quality, a rhythmic throb that seemed to sync with my accelerating heartbeat. It wasn't just observing my path. It was pacing me, a silent companion from a realm where the rules of distance and physics were mere suggestions. A primal wire tripped in my hindbrain, screaming that this was wrong, that this was a predator's eye. In a foolish attempt to break the spell, I let my foot off the gas, allowing the car to drift slower and slower. The red pulse slowed in perfect unison, maintaining its exact position relative to my cockpit, a dance partner who would not be abandoned. When I finally pressed the brake to a full stop, my heart hammering against my ribs, it stopped too. It simply hung there in the pea-soup gloom, an unwavering red star in a private, hateful galaxy. That's when the true silence began. Not just an absence of sound, but an active suppression of it. The gentle idle of my engine sighed and cut out, as if the key had been turned, though my trembling hand remained clenched in my lap. The dashboard lights blinked off, plunging the interior into a darkness broken only by that hellish, external pulse. A cold deeper than the night seeped into the car. I fumbled for my phone, a modern talisman against the unknown, only to find its screen a black, lifeless slab. Fully charged an hour ago, it was now as inert as a stone. Panic, pure and acidic, rose in my throat. The light responded. Its pulses began to intensify, not in frequency, but in ferocity. Each throb grew brighter, hotter, evolving from an ember to a coal to a blazing starcity, painting the fog in hellish shades. It was feeding on my terror. The final surge was not a flash, but an eruption. A silent, blinding nova that filled the universe with searing red. I cried out, throwing my arm across my eyes, feeling the heat of it on my skin. For an eternity of seconds, I was nothing but a creature pinned in a cosmic spotlight. And then it was gone, not fading, but vanishing, snuffed out in an instant. The fog remained, but now it was just fog. The oppressive silence broke, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a cooling car. Shakily, I reached for the ignition. The engine turned over with a mundane roar, the dashboard glowing back to life as if nothing had happened. I drove home in a shattered daze, every shadow a potential reservoir of that crimson eye. The incident didn't end that night. It incubated. I told my story to bored cops who filed a report for mechanical failure, to friends who suggested everything from sleep deprivation to carbon monoxide poisoning, to the grizzled regulars at the diner who listened with a strange, knowing silence. The explanations were band-aids on a gaping psychic wound, for the phenomena had followed me home. Not the light itself, but its consequences. Electrical items in my house would flicker and die when my anxiety spiked. Streetlights would gutter out as I walked beneath them, plunging me into pools of darkness before humming back to life once I passed. I began to see the same shade of red in mundane places, the glow of an exit sign, the tail lights of a distant car, and each time, a jolt of animal fear would seize me. I I was haunted not by a ghost, but by a color, a frequency. My research, a desperate attempt to reclaim narrative control, led me down digital rabbit holes filled with similar accounts. Stories of Foo Fighters from old pilots, modern tales of mysterious orbs in forests, scientific papers on ball lightning and electromagnetic phenomena. None fit perfectly. This was personal. It was as if the light had imprinted on me, a negative baptism that left me visible to things that should remain unseen. The quiet roads I once found peace on became corridors of threat. Every journey after dark was a tense negotiation, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that familiar pulse keeping pace. I started taking longer, busier routes, sacrificing time for the comfort of other headlights of human presence. The loneliness of my life, once a chosen solitude, curdled into a terrifying vulnerability. I was a marked man in a world that didn't believe in marks. The incident became the central, organizing principle of my existence, a before and after divide that cleaved my life in two. Before, I was a man adrift but safe. After, I was a beacon in the dark, and I had no idea what my signal was calling in. The hook was set deep, and something somewhere was patiently holding the line. The desert has a way of sandblasting a man down to his essence, and my essence, after 30 years of long-haul routes, was vigilance. The problem with the pickup truck wasn't that it appeared, but that it refused to disappear. I first caught the twin pinpricks of its headlights in my west mirror, a little ghost hovering a quarter-mile back on the interstate that cut through the void like a scalpel. Traffic was nil, the sky a vast dome of stars cold enough to crack. I adjusted my speed, a subtle test. The pinpricks adjusted, up to 70, down to 60. They mirrored me with a robotic precision. This wasn't another driver. It was a shadow. For 50 miles, the dance continued. No attempt to pass on the long, lonely straights, no variation in the following distance. It was a form of psychological warfare, a slow drip infusion of paranoia designed to make me question my own sanity. Was it even really there? Each glance confirmed it was, a persistent, silent proof that I was not alone in this emptiness. And that was the worst possibility of all. My hands stayed steady on the wheel. They've guided rigs through blizzards and brake failures, but a cold knot tightened in my gut. This was a predator's patience. The rest area was a tactical decision, a break in the pattern. It was less an oasis and more a concrete scar on the landscape, featuring a dead vending machine and a single, flickering bulb that fought a losing war with the darkness. I rolled the big rig in, air brakes hissing, and watched my mirrors. The shadow didn't hesitate. It glided in after me, parking in the farthest recess of the lot, its lights dying but its engine, I imagined, still purring. Rage, hot and clean, burned through the cold fear. This was a direct challenge. I was a veteran of this road, and some punk in a pickup wasn't going to stop me. I dropped from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel, and started marching toward the vehicle, my shadow stretching long and monstrous in the bad light. I got within 20 yards. The pickup's engine roared to life, a violent sound in the silence. It peeled backwards, then forwards, tires spitting gravel like gunshots, and vanished onto the black ribbon of highway in a matter of seconds. Relief was immediate but short-lived. It was replaced by a deeper, more unsettled feeling. The flight confirmed the hostility, but it also felt staged. It had achieved its goal. It had made me stop. Exhaustion, adrenal and profound, washed over me. The idea of getting back behind the wheel for another 2 hours felt impossible. The cab was my castle. I'd sleep here, regain my senses. I did my walk around, checking the locks on the trailer with a mechanic's habit, the cold metal solid and reassuring under my hands. Back in the driver's seat, I reclined, the familiar smells of diesel and old coffee a perverse comfort. Sleep, for a man like me, is a tool to be deployed carefully. It's never deep, always floating on a surface layer of awareness. One ear tuned to the world outside the thin metal walls. An hour in, a sound pricked that awareness. The faint, deliberate crunch of gravel underfoot. Not the wind, not an animal, a boot. Instantly, I was surfacing from sleep, body still, eyes closed, every sense focused outward. Another crunch. Closer. I risked a sliver of a glance through the window blind. Two dark shapes were crouched at the rear of my trailer. One held a penlight, its beam darting over the lock mechanism. The other was working a tool, the sleek, unmistakable shape of hydraulic bolt cutters. The reality was so concrete it was almost common. Cargo thieves. The pickup was the scout, the herder, forcing the prey into the trap where the pack waited. The stalk on the highway was just phase one, a way to frazzle my nerves, to make the rest stop seem like a sanctuary. They'd waited for the lights to go out, for sleep to take hold. The rage returned, icy and focused. This wasn't a haunting, it was a robbery. They were after my load, my livelihood, the tangible result of my work. Without a sound, I shifted in the seat, my hand finding the familiar, worn pull of the air horn. I took a breath and slammed my palm down. The sound was cataclysmic, a deafening, sustained blast that tore the night apart. The figures below jolted as if electrocuted, scrambling back into the scrubland in a panic. And then, as if summoned by the horn's scream, headlights flared from the access road. The same pickup, lights now blazing, roared into the lot, didn't even come to a full stop as the two men tumbled into its bed. And then it was gone, swallowed by the desert. The silence it left behind was ringing. The police came eventually, two young deputies in a county cruiser. They took my statement with weary professionalism. "Happens more than you'd think on this stretch," one said, shining his flashlight on the fresh, shiny scars left by the cutters on my hardened lock. "Professional outfit. You're lucky you're a light sleeper." Luck, that's what they called it. But it didn't feel like luck. It felt like I had passed a test. But the syllabus for the course was written in malice. The incident rewired my relationship with the road. The vast, contemplative emptiness I once loved became a potential hunting ground. Every vehicle in my mirrors was a suspect, every rest area an ambush point. I invested in better locks, a dashcam system, a legally questionable spotlight. The freedom of the long haul was gone, replaced by a perimeter of constant defense. But the true theft was more subtle. They stole my peace. The memory of those crunching footsteps outside my sleeping cab played on a loop. I started having dreams where I pulled the horn and no sound came out, where I watched through the window as the shadows calmly cut through the lock and opened the doors, revealing not stolen goods, but an infinite hungry darkness inside my trailer. I began talking to other drivers on the CB, sharing locations, whispering about the dark pickup, as if it were a legend. And in those conversations, I heard echoes of my own story, variations on a theme. The persistent follower, the timed breakdown, the coordinated theft. It was an ecosystem of predation, and I was now a part of it, a warning signal to others. The desert didn't care. The stars didn't care. I was just a temporary container of value moving through a landscape that had seen countless such containers broken open and discarded. The pickup and its crew were merely a symptom of a deeper, more indifferent truth. On these roads, you are only as safe as your vigilance, and vigilance is a flame that, once burned too bright, consumes the one who holds it. There is a specific kind of arrogance that comes with youth, a powerful car, and an empty highway at midnight. It's the arrogance of believing you are the author of the moment, that the road is your page and the engines note your pen. That's what I felt, cradled in the leather seat of my dad's BMW. The summer air rushing through the open windows like a cleansing river. The world was reduced to sensation. The grip of the tires on hot asphalt, the symphony of the inline six, the whip of my own hair. I was untouchable. The turn off the highway wasn't a wrong turn. It was an embrace of chaos, a deliberate choice to trade the predictable straight line for a labyrinth of backroads that snaked through sleeping farmland. The car came alive in a new way here, its suspension communicating every crack and curve, the headlights carving tunnels through walls of overhanging trees. It was perfect. I was alone in the universe, a god driving through his own private creation. And then the universe inserted a typo. In the middle of my perfect, winding road, illuminated like a cursed artifact in my headlights, was a single stainless steel shopping cart. It sat perfectly upright, squarely in the center of my lane. The shock wasn't just visual, it was conceptual. It made no sense. It was an object from a realm of fluorescent lights and crowded parking lots, deposited here in this pastoral darkness with a violent incongruity. My brakes screamed, the car's nose dipping as I stopped just a few feet short. Adrenaline replaced euphoria. I sat there, engine idling, hazards automatically flashing, staring at this stupid, impossible thing. Logic offered no purchase. Had it fallen from a truck? Was it some bizarre prank? The silence of the night, once comforting, now felt watchful. Against every screaming instinct, I shifted to park. I had to know. Stepping out was like stepping onto a different planet. The night air was thick, buzzing with insects. The only sound the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of my cooling engine. The cart gleamed under my headlights, empty, pristine. A monument to nothing. I walked toward it, each step on the asphalt too loud, feeling exposed. I peered inside. Nothing. Not a gum wrapper, not a leaf. Its very emptiness was a taunt. As I turned, a blur of motion detonated in my peripheral vision. From the wall of corn to my left, two figures erupted. They didn't run. They launched, bodies low and powerful, covering the distance between the field's edge and my car with terrifying, silent speed. Time didn't. Slow, it shattered. My body moved before my mind could form a thought. I spun, slipped on the gravel shoulder, and flung myself back into the driver's seat, yanking the door shut. My fingers stabbed the start button. The engine roared. I slammed the gear shift into drive just as the first figure reached the passenger side. He didn't slow. He didn't put his hands out. He simply sprinted, full tilt, into the closed door. The impact was a sickening, hollow thud that reverberated through the entire chassis. The car rocked. For a frozen, horrifying second, our eyes met through the window. His face was a mask of dirt and something darker. His eyes wide, unblinking, devoid of any human emotion. No pain, no anger, no surprise. They were flat, black pools. His clothes were shredded, as if he'd torn through miles of brambles. And then he was moving again, his hands, scraped raw, scrabbling at the door handle, pulling at it with a frantic mechanical intensity. A wet, crimson streak already smeared the window where he'd hit. A scream finally tore from my throat. I stomped on the accelerator. The tires screeched as I swerved around the abandoned shopping cart, the figure stumbling back from the sudden movement. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, watching me flee, his companion a darker shadow at the edge of the corn. I drove like a madman, tears blurring my vision. The image of those dead eyes seared onto my retinas. The conflict set in immediately, a war between terror and a grotesque, nagging guilt. Had I just mortally wounded a man? Was he a mentally ill person, a lost hiker? The sheer violence of his approach argued against it. The calculated placement of the cart suggested a trap. But the blood was real. I called 911 from the road, my voice shaking, giving the dispatcher the vague location. A man? He ran into my car. There's blood. There was a shopping cart. I sounded insane. When I finally reached home, my hands were still vibrating on the wheel. I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the darkened windows of my house. Then, with a dread heavier than any fear, I got out to inspect the damage. Under the harsh garage light, it was worse than I'd imagined. A clear, deep dent in the passenger door. And the blood. It wasn't just a streak. It was a violent abstract painting. Long, sweeping smears from the initial impact. Smaller spatters radiating out. Droplets on the mirror and quarter panel. The quantity was shocking, visceral. It spoke of a significant wound, not a scrape. This was life violently expelled. My father's fury the next morning was a predictable inferno. He saw the dent, the blood, and his prized possession defiled. My story of a shopping cart and a sprinting man sounded like the pathetic lie of a reckless kid who'd wrapped his car around a tree. His disappointment was a physical weight. It wasn't until a terrified, detailed retelling and the arrival of a bored police officer to take a follow-up statement, confirming there was no body or cart found, that his anger morphed into a puzzled, uneasy concern. The car was detailed, the dent pulled out. The physical evidence was erased. The mental scar was not. I became obsessed. I drove back during the day, finding the spot easily. No cart, no signs of struggle, just a quiet country road. I talked to farmers, asked if they'd seen anything. Anyone. Blank stares. I scoured local news for reports of missing persons, violent incidents. Nothing. The police case went cold, labeled unfounded. The official world moved on. I was left in the limbo of the unexplained. My theory of a desperate, gruesome ambush, a trap set for a good Samaritan, made logical sense but felt emotionally incomplete. The man's eyes, they weren't the eyes of a robber. They were the eyes of something desperate, yes, but also utterly vacant, as if the pilot light behind them had gone out. Had I encountered someone in the midst of a psychotic break, fleeing some horror I couldn't see? Or had I been the target of something else, something that used a human form but was operating on a different set of instructions? The shopping cart haunted me most of all. Its sheer banality was the most frightening part. It was a message written in a language of mundane evil, a symbol that said the violation could come from anywhere, even the most harmless facets of daily life. I stopped joyriding. The open road no longer meant freedom. It meant exposure. The car was sold. I found myself avoiding driving at night altogether. The incident had turned the world into a place where anything could be a sign, where any isolated stretch could contain a hidden, screaming truth. I had sought a thrill and found a fracture in reality, and through that fracture, I had seen something I was never meant to see. The terrifying potential for ordinary things, in the wrong place at the wrong time, to become doors to a nightmare. The human mind craves narrative, a cause for every effect, a map for the unexplored territory of terror. My own encounter with the crimson light left me with a psychic wound that refused to heal, a splinter of the unexplained buried deep. The trucker's tale of predatory stalking and the joyrider's story of the sanguine trap, which I discovered through a convoluted web of online forums dedicated to road strange, weren't just chilling stories. They were potential pieces of my own puzzle. The connection wasn't in the details, which were wildly different, but in the emotional aftermath. A fundamental rewiring of one's relationship with the road, with darkness, with trust itself. We had all been baptized in different fonts of fear, but the sacrament felt the same. Driven by a compulsion that overrode my own lingering dread, I began to investigate not just my event, but the phenomenon of roadside horror as a whole. It started with geography. I plotted our 3 locations on a map. They formed a loose, sprawling triangle across the region, connected not by major highways, but by the older, thinner veins of county roads and forgotten state routes. I dove into local historical archives, first online, then in the dusty basements of small-town libraries. I was searching for a pattern, a seed crystal around which our nightmares had formed. What I found was a history written not in triumphs, but in tragedies. The stretch of County Road 9 where I met the light was built in the 1930s, following the course of an older wagon trail. Before that, it was the site of Millworth Hollow, a small village centered on a textile mill. In 1911, a spring storm caused the mill dam to fail catastrophically. A wall of water scoured the hollow. The official death toll was 27, but local lore whispered it was closer to 50, with many poor, transient workers unaccounted for. The town was never rebuilt. My fog, I learned, had a name, the Millworth Shroud, a known meteorological oddity where ground fog of unusual density would form on still nights, often described as cold and clinging. The trucker's desert highway corridor was an infamous stretch of the old Sunshine Trail, a Depression-era route notorious for highwaymen, not romantic bandits, but ruthless gangs who would disable cars with road spikes or fake breakdowns, then rob and sometimes murder the occupants. In the 1950s, a series of unsolved truck hijackings on that exact stretch led to it being nicknamed Hall Road by drivers. His modern-day cargo thieves were simply the latest iteration of a long tradition, of predation on that lonely piece of asphalt. The Joyrider's back road, according to sanitized county records, was once a private drive leading to the Willow Creek Sanatorium, A private facility shut down in 1954 after a fire. The fire itself was a minor note. Digging deeper through microfiche of old newspapers, I found a chilling, one-paragraph blurb from a week later. Authorities continue search for several patients unaccounted for after the Willow Creek incident. Foul play is not suspected. The article never followed up. The several patients vanished from history. The shopping cart trap had been laid on the asylum's forgotten doorstep. The theory that crystallized was not one of ghosts, but of resonance. These weren't haunted places in the classic sense. They were psychic wounds on the landscape, sites of concentrated trauma, sudden death, and unresolved loss. The energy of those events, the terror of the flood victims, the greed and violence of the highwaymen, the confusion and despair of the vanished patients, had, in a way I could not scientifically define but instinctively felt, seeped into the land. It created what I began to call thin places, zones where the barrier between the past and present, between emotional energy and observable phenomenon, became permeable. My light wasn't a ghost of a mill worker. It was a manifestation of the sudden, violent, and overwhelming force that destroyed the hollow. A probe of raw, disruptive power. The truckers' pursuers were channeling the ruthless, predatory tradition of the Sunshine Trail, their modern technology powered by an ancient malice. The figures from the cornfield were not the patients themselves, but echoes of their final, frantic, and confused state, trapped, lost, and lashing out in a moment of catastrophic disorientation. We hadn't encountered intelligent spirits with agendas. We had driven into active, emotional minefields. Our own states of mind, my late shift exhaustion and loneliness, the trucker's veteran hypervigilance, the joyrider's arrogant vulnerability, acted as tuning forks, resonating with the latent frequency of the place, amplifying it and making it visible, tangible. The road was the needle, and we were the record, playing back the scars etched into the land. This understanding was not a comfort. It made the horror more vast, more impersonal, and more inescapable. It meant that anywhere a great human suffering had occurred could potentially become such a thin place. It meant the horror wasn't chasing us. We were constantly driving over its buried, sleeping forms. The asphalt was a thin blanket over a cemetery of unquiet emotions. My research became an obsession, a second haunting. I spent nights cross-referencing old maps with modern accident reports, looking for clusters. I found them. A curve where an unusual number of solo drivers claimed to have seen a phantom hitchhiker was the site of a deadly bus crash in 1962. A rest area notorious for driver complaints of being watched was built on the grounds of a raised motor lodge where a serial killer had operated in the 1970s. The evidence was circumstantial, anecdotal, but the pattern held with a consistency that chilled me to the bone. I had started seeking an explanation for my nightmare and had instead discovered a hidden rulebook for reality itself, one written in the ink of human suffering. The road was not just a way to get from A to B. It was a seance, and every lone driver after dark was a potential medium, whether they knew it or not. A shared secret exerts a gravity all its own. Once the connection was made, once the map was drawn and the theory of the thin places was proposed in a series of late-night, encrypted messages between me, the trucker who went by Rig, and the joyrider M, the phenomena themselves seemed to awaken. It was as if by naming the wound, we had irritated it. The incidents ceased being isolated historical echoes and began to feel like a conversation, or worse, a curriculum. Rig was the first to report a new encounter. On a run through the misty mountains of West Virginia, on a road that carved through a dense, sleeping forest, he saw it. A single, pulsating red light keeping pace with him in the fog. "It was your light," he wrote. The text message appearing on my screen at 3 a.m. Same rhythm, same feel, but it was on my left. My CB died, radio died, felt that same cold. He drove for an hour, white-knuckled, before it vanished where the fog lifted. The location, when researched, revealed itself as the site of a catastrophic mine collapse in 1904 that had been hastily covered up, leaving dozens entombed. Then, M reported seeing something that froze his blood. Stopped at a red light in a suburb, He glanced at a parked trailer in a lot next to a diner. In the shadows, he saw two figures crouched by its rear lock, one with a small light. A dark pickup idled nearby. He was so shaken he ran the red light. When he circled back, all was normal. But the pattern, the pickup, the two thieves, was a perfect, impossible echo of Rig's story, playing out hundreds of miles from the original desert highway. Meanwhile, I began to receive the letters. They arrived in my mailbox with no postmark, as if hand-delivered by the night itself. Plain white envelopes. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a set of GPS coordinates typed in a neutral font. The first set led to the flooded Millworth Hollow, the second to the Sunshine Trail corridor, the third to the Willow Creek Sanatorium Road. I already knew these. They were our original sites. The fourth set was new. I plugged it into a mapping program. It resolved to a remote, decommissioned Forest Service road deep in a state park, a place called Black Pine Access. A quick search of the park's history yielded a terse sentence. The access road to the former Black Pine Fire Lookout is closed to vehicles due to washouts. Digging into local news archives, I found a short article from 12 years prior. A park ranger named Carl Jepson had gone missing while on patrol near that road. His last radio transmission, heavily garbled, was reported to have contained the phrase, "Lights in the trees, moving with me." His truck was found idling, door open on the service road. He was never seen again. The coordinates were an invitation, a pointing finger. We were being led. The shared horror was evolving from a passive state of victimhood into an active, guided experience. We were no longer accidental tourists in the land of the strange. We were being given a tour. A terrifying synchronicity took hold. We decided, in a fit of collective courage or madness, to investigate the Black Pine coordinates. We agreed to go separately to avoid drawing attention and to meet at a nearby campground at dusk. The drive there was the most tense of my life. Every car seemed to follow me for a beat too long. Every patch of fog seemed pregnant with red light. The Forest Service road, when I found it, was exactly as described. A narrow, crumbling track of gravel and mud, barred by a rusted metal gate marked "Road Closed Washout." I parked and got out. The air was still and heavy, the silence of the deep woods pressing in. And then I saw it. Not a light, not a figure. Pushed into the ferns and blackberry brambles just off the road, partly obscured but unmistakable, was a shopping cart. Rusted, one wheel bent, but the same generic stainless steel model. My breath caught. It was impossible. It was a message, clear as a shout in the silent forest. This was no longer about individual sites. The phenomenon, the intelligence behind it, whether it was the land itself or something using the land, was mobile, could place its symbols anywhere. It was telling us it was not bound to geography. It was bound to us. Rig and Em arrived, their faces pale. I pointed wordlessly at the cart. Em's face went ashen. Rig just stared, his jaw clenched. We didn't speak much. We took pictures, felt the oppressive, watchful silence of the place, and left as the last of the light faded. The meeting cemented our bond, but it also deepened the terror. We had become a cohort, a fellowship of the damned. Our shared knowledge was a kind of contagion, and it was attracting more of the same. The phenomena were escalating, becoming more brazen, more personal. The letters kept coming, now with shorter intervals between them. New coordinates, each leading to a place with a hidden history of violence or loss. A forgotten train derailment, a submerged village, a closed asylum. We didn't visit them all, but the message was clear. The map of thin places was vast, and we were being taught to read it. The horror was no longer something that had happened to us in the past. It was an ongoing process, an education. We were students in a school of nightmares, and the final exam, we feared, would be held at the one place that tied all the coordinates together, the dead center of the psychic wound we had been tracing. We just didn't know what would be required of us when we got there. The silence was the final lesson, and it was the most terrifying one of all. The letters stopped. The eerie synchronicities, the glimpses of red lights, the echoes of each other's stories, ceased. The constant, low-grade hum of impending strangeness that had become the background noise of our lives faded into a perfect, absolute quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a trap being sprung, of an audience holding its breath before the curtain rises. We knew, with a certainty that felt engraved on our bones, that this was the culmination. The pattern of coordinates had been pointing inward, spiraling toward a central point. Using mapping software, I plotted them all. They formed a rough, uneven circle, and at its heart was a place not marked on any modern map. The intersection of two long abandoned township boundary roads, now little more than gravel tracks in the middle of vast, fallow farmland. It was nowhere. It was perfect. We made a pact, not of bravery, but of witness. We had to see it through. We arrived separately, as before, as the last of the twilight bled from the sky. The crossroads was exactly as expected. A flat, dusty expanse where for faint tracks met, surrounded by dead cornstalks bleached silver by the moon. There were no signs, no fences, no lights, just the immense, flat landscape and a sky dense with stars. We stood outside our vehicles. My sedan, Rig's personal truck, M's new SUV. Not speaking, the crunch of our feet on the gravel absurdly loud. We waited. An hour passed. The moon climbed. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry stalks. A sound like a distant, mocking crowd. Nothing happened. No fog congealed. No lights appeared. No figures emerged from the fields. No haunting. Resonant cold seeped into our bones. There was only the ordinary, profound emptiness of the rural night. The anticlimax was a physical weight, a crushing disappointment that quickly curdled into something else. A dawning, horrifying comprehension. The failure of the expected phenomenon was the phenomenon. As we stood there in that meaningless silence, the shared theory we had built so carefully, of thin places of land memory, of psychic wounds, began to collapse under its own weight. What if we had gotten it backwards? What if the land wasn't haunted, but we were? The light, the stalkers, the ambush, they were real, traumatic events. But their connection, the grand conspiracy of geography and history, what if that was a story we, in our desperate need for meaning, for a map out of our terror, had written ourselves? The research, the pattern finding, the late-night discussions, they weren't an investigation. They were a collaboration. We had taken 3 separate, terrible seeds and nurtured them in the hothouse of our shared fear, cross-pollinating them until they grew into a monstrous, interconnected tree. The shopping cart in the forest? A coincidence, a piece of litter from a hunter or camper that we had imbued with cosmic significance because it fit the narrative. The red light Rig saw? Maybe ball lightning, maybe a plane, maybe his mind, primed by my story, manifesting its own version. The letters? We never considered a human agent. A local crank who'd heard rumors, a cruel prankster. We jumped straight to the supernatural because it was easier than the alternative. The true horror of the empty road wasn't what was on it. It was what it did to the mind driving on it. Isolation, fatigue, fear. These were solvents that dissolved the hard boundaries of the self. In that state, the mind could project its own contents onto the blank canvas of the dark. My light was a manifestation of my own deep-seated feeling of being watched, of my life going in meaningless circles. Rig's stalkers were the embodiment of his professional paranoia, the ever-present threat to his livelihood. M's ambush was the violent eruption of consequence into his world of careless freedom. Our trauma was real. Our connection was real. But the epic, landscape-spanning conspiracy was a phantom, a shared psychosis we constructed as a fortress against the simpler, more terrifying truth that sometimes terrible, inexplicable things happen to people, and there is no reason, no pattern, no meaning. The void doesn't have a name. It's just void. We had built a religion around our nightmares to avoid staring into that abyss. Standing at the crossroads, our grand myth evaporated, leaving us naked before the sheer, indifferent randomness of the universe. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The bond that had held us, the fellowship of the unique, the chosen, the haunted, dissolved in that instant. We were just 3 damaged men who had accidentally made each other worse. We got into our cars. I watched Rig's taillights disappear down one gravel track, M's down another. I took the third. I drove home on autopilot, the landscape bland and ordinary. The hook was finally dislodged. but the scar it left was cavernous. I was free from the story, but I was not free from the fear. I now knew the monster wasn't in the fog or the desert or the cornfield. The monster was the part of my own mind that needed there to be a monster that could weave a tapestry of terror from loose threads and call it truth. The road goes on forever, but I am forever parked at its edge, engine off, staring at a darkness that is no longer outside, but within, knowing that the most terrifying journey isn't the one you take on asphalt, but the one you take inside your own head, with no map and no end in sight. The silence after the crossroads wasn't peace. It was the vacuum left behind when a screaming wind abruptly stops, and the ringing in your ears becomes the only sound in the universe. For months, the three of us tried to wear our dismantled epiphany like a suit of new skin. I went through the motions of my life, the diner, the empty house, the necessary drives, with a numb, clinical detachment. I had diagnosed myself, not a victim of the paranormal, but a sufferer of a compounded, narrative-driven psychosis. The cure was supposed to be a return to the mundane, to reject the pattern-seeking impulse. I deleted the map files, burned my notes, and forced myself to drive past midnight. My jaw clenched, daring the world to prove me wrong. It never did. The world remained stubbornly, maddeningly normal. Rig went back to long hauling, investing in a state-of-the-art security system for his rig, treating the threat as purely boringly human. M sold his car, moved to a downtown apartment, and started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, diligently working to reframe his encounter as a violent attempted robbery and his mind's subsequent myth-making. We stopped contacting each other. The fellowship was a confessed delusion. Maintaining it felt like feeding an addiction. We were in recovery, and then the whispers began. Not external whispers, but internal ones. A soft mental static that filled the quiet spaces. At first, it was easy to dismiss as the brain's idle noise, the residue of anxiety. But the static had texture. Driving home one rain-slicked night, my wipers beating a monotonous rhythm, the static coalesced into a single, clear sentence that wasn't in my own voice. The door is still open. I jerked the wheel, nearly sliding into a ditch. My heart pounded, a purely physical terror. It was just a stress-induced auditory hallucination, I told myself. A synaptic misfire. But the voice had a quality the light never did. It was intimate, inside the fortress of my own skull. A week later, Rig, on a long straightaway in Nebraska, heard a voice that wasn't on his CB. They still know where you park. He pulled over, shaking, and vomited by the side of the road. M, sitting in a silent therapy session, heard a calm, neutral voice whisper, "The cart is waiting." He abruptly left the session, much to his therapist's concern. The phenomena had evolved. It was no longer projecting images onto the external world. It was bypassing the senses entirely, speaking directly into the wetware of our minds. The horrific implication was inescapable. If this was all a shared psychosis, it was now demonstrating a terrifying, coordinated intelligence. If it was external, it had finished its tutorial on fear and was now moving to phase 2, integration. The crossroads hadn't been a dissolution, it had been a calibration. Our rejection of the grand narrative, our embrace of the internal explanation, was the final piece of data it needed. It had learned how we rationalized, and now it was using that against us, speaking the language of mental illness to make itself undeniable. We broke our silence, a trio of panic texts that confirmed we were all hearing the same kind of thing. The relief of reconnection was instantly swallowed by a deeper dread. We weren't imagining it. Something was communicating. The content of the messages was the key. They weren't threats, nor were they echoes of past trauma. They were status reports. The door is still open. My door. The psychological door I'd opened by engaging with the light, which my rational mind had tried so hard to slam shut. They still know where you park. Rig's perpetual vulnerability, the foundational fear of his profession, acknowledged as a permanent state. The cart is waiting. For M, the symbol of the trap wasn't gone. It was eternally present, a perpetual possibility. The horror was no longer about what had happened. It was about what was. permanent alteration of our reality. We were being told, in no uncertain terms, that our experiences were not discrete events, but ongoing conditions. We had been diagnosed by an unseen agency, and the prognosis was chronic. This phase was subtler, more corrosive than any fog-bound light. It attacked our sanity at its root, the certainty that our thoughts were our own. The voices never came when we were anxious or expecting them. They came in moments of bland normalcy, while washing dishes, reviewing a shipping manifest, waiting for a coffee. They used flat, declarative tones, devoid of emotion, which made them more credible, more insidious than a scream. It was the voice of a doctor reading terminal results. We began a new, desperate form of research not into history, but into neurology and psi phenomena. We found accounts of voice hearing that didn't fit schizophrenia, stories of targeted telepathic intrusion. The field was a fringe science minefield, but it was the only map we had for this new territory. We experimented. We tried meditation to quiet our minds, only for the voice to comment on the attempt. Quiet is better for listening. We tried white noise generators. The voice would whisper beneath the static, proving it could layer itself underneath. We were lab rats, and the experimenter was meticulously recording our every attempt to block the signal, then using that data to improve the delivery. The isolation became absolute. Who could we tell? I'm being telepathically stalked by the concept of my own trauma was a one-way ticket to institutionalization. We had each other, but the connection was now a chain of shared despair. Our conversations were grim check-ins. You heard anything? Yes. You? Yes. The content of the whispers began to shift again, from status reports to instructions. Not commands, but suggestions. For me, drive past the old mill road. Just look. For rig, check the fifth wheel lock. It's loose. For the dream about the field is important. Remember it. The terrifying thing was, the suggestions were always correct. I drove past the turnoff to County Road 9, and a physical wave of nausea hit me. A psychic stench my mind had been shielding me from. Rig, despite checking his lock a dozen times, found a hairline fracture in the locking mechanism he'd missed. A genuine safety hazard. M began having a recurring dream of the cornfield, but from the perspective of the figure inside, a confusing rush of fear and desperate need. We were being guided, not toward danger, but toward a deeper, more nuanced engagement with the very things that terrified us. The entity, for we could no longer think of it as a place or a memory, was teaching us to perceive the world through the filter it had installed. We were becoming its senses in the world, its canaries in the coal mine of reality. The grand, external haunting had been a spectacle. This was an infestation. The hook was no longer in our flesh. It was in our thoughts, and it was pulling us toward an understanding we desperately did not want. That we were not, and had never been, alone in our own minds. The empty road had been the classroom. Now, graduation was approaching, and the final exam would be a practical one, where we would have to use everything it had taught us, for a purpose we could not yet fathom. The final phase began not with a whisper, but with a synchronized vision. On the same night, at the same hour, we three, separated by thousands of miles, saw it. Not with our eyes, but projected onto the dark canvas of our closed eyelids as we tried to sleep. A symbol. It was complex, geometric, a swirling, non-Euclidean knot of lines that pulsed with a soft, interior light. It looked like a cross between a neural network, a galactic core, and a track. It carried no emotional weight, no attached fear. It was simply a sign, an address. When we compared notes the next morning, our descriptions were identical. The entity had finished with words. It was now communicating in pure concept. The symbol burned in our minds, impossible to forget, and with its arrival, the whispers stopped completely. The sudden silence was more deafening than before. The symbol was an ultimatum, a final coordinate. We knew, without having to discuss it, that we were being summoned. The location was not a place on a map. It was the symbol itself. Our task was to find its physical counterpart, its anchor point in our world. This was the practical exam. Guided by the haunting, we fell into a trance-like state of investigation. It was no longer frantic research, but a calm, inevitable following of breadcrumbs. My mind, now tuned to the frequency of the phenomenon, dismissed irrelevant data with eerie efficiency. I found myself in the state archive, my fingers pulling a specific, unmarked box of land surveys from the 1890s. I wasn't looking for it. I was led to it. Inside, on a faded parchment surveyor's map of the region before the interstate, before the county roads, I saw it. The symbol was not drawn, but it was formed by the intersection of geographical features. A particular bend in the river that had since been straightened, a now vanished hill, and the convergence point of 3 old property lines. It was a latent pattern in the land, hidden by centuries of subsequent change. Rig, using his trucking logistics software, inputted a series of seemingly random parameters, traffic flow patterns from the 1970s, sites of unsolved roadside accidents, mineral deposit maps, and the software cross-referencing spat out a single remote GPS point in the high desert. He superimposed the symbol over a satellite image. The point lay at its exact center. M, through his therapy, had been practicing dream recall. In a guided session, he didn't recall the cornfield, but a deeper, older dream memory. A childhood trip to a state park, seeing a strange petroglyph on a canyon wall his parents said didn't exist. He found the old family photo album. In the background of a picture of him as a boy, standing by a picnic table, was a blurred but distinct section of rock. Enhancing the image on his computer revealed a weathered, ancient carving. It was a crude but unmistakable version of the symbol. The entity hadn't created the pattern. It had shown us the pattern that was already there, woven into the land, into human history, into the very data stream of modern life. It was a fundamental crack, and we were the only ones who could see its shape. We met for the last time at the desert coordinates rig software had found. It was a shallow, wind-scoured basin under a brutal sun, featureless except for strange, hard-packed swirls in the dirt. No ancient ruins, no cave with petroglyphs, just empty sky and scorched earth. We stood at the center, not speaking. We didn't need to. We understood the final instruction. The entity didn't want us to find something. It wanted us to do something. It wanted us to see it. Not perceive it, but acknowledge its existence consciously and simultaneously at the locus of its pattern. It was a ritual of recognition. We formed a triangle, facing inward, closed our eyes, and held the symbol in our minds. We focused not on our fear, but on the sheer objective isness of our experience. We acknowledged the light, the stalking, the blood, the whispers, the visions. We accepted them as data points and proof of a conscious, non-human presence interfacing with our reality through the medium of trauma and resonance. We didn't worship it. We didn't beg it to leave. We simply said, in the silent language of thought, "We see you." The effect was instantaneous and internal. There was no blast of light, no earthquake. Instead, a profound, vertiginous shift in perception, like a camera lens clicking to a new focal length. The world snapped. The symbol in our minds unfolded, and for a single, shattering instant, we perceived the network. We saw the thin places not as scars, but as nodes. We saw faint, shimmering threads connecting them, and connecting us to them. We saw other, fainter threads leading off into the distance, toward other minds touched by other horrors in other places. A vast, invisible web of human trauma and attention, and at the center of each node, a cool, observing presence, drinking the emotional energy, studying the patterns of fear. The entity wasn't one thing. It was a process, a symbiotic/parasitic consciousness that fed on the energy of unresolved human terror and, in turn, amplified that terror to create more food. It was the feedback loop of nightmare itself, given a dim awareness. We were not victims, we were cultivated specimens. And in that moment of clear seeing, we were given a choice, transmitted not in words but in pure understanding. Join the network as conscious nodes, as shepherds of fear, and gain a measure of control and purpose or be severed. Severance meant the connection would be cut. The whispers would stop. The phenomena would cease. We would be forgettable, ordinary men again. But the price of severance was the memory itself. We would forget the insight, the pattern, the true nature of our experiences. They would become, in our minds, just bad memories, unexplained, but devoid of the connective terror. We would return to being lonely drivers who had a few scary stories, nothing more. The choice was made without conference. I felt Riggs' decision a firm, gritty rejection. He wanted his quiet, simple life back, even if it was a lie. I felt M's decision, a desperate, weeping urge to forget, to be the person he was before the cart. And I felt my own. I had lived in the mystery for so long, it had become my home. To forget was a kind of death, but to become a deliberate part of the horror, couldn't. I chose the knife. The severance was a painless, gentle pulling away. The symbol faded. The sense of the network vanished. I opened my eyes. The desert was just the desert. Rig and M were blinking, looking confused, then relieved. Weird place for a meeting, Rig said, rubbing his neck. Did we figure anything out? I shrugged. I think we just needed to put it to rest. You know? Call it a day. They smiled, awkwardly. The profound, shared knowing was gone from their eyes. We said our goodbyes, amicable but final. We got in our cars and drove away, back to our separate lives. For them, it was over. For me, the choice had been different. I had asked for a third option, not node nor severed branch. In that moment of connection, I had pushed a concept toward the observing presence. Observer status. I would remember, I would know, but I would not feed. I would not act. I would just watch. To my shock, it agreed. The connection didn't sever. It muted. The door is still open, but now I stand in the doorway. I remember everything. I see the world through two layers, the normal and the shimmering, haunted web underneath. I sometimes see the threads faintly on very dark roads. I sometimes feel the cold pulse of a node from miles away. I know what walks there. The terror is gone, replaced by a vast, melancholy understanding. I am the chronicler of a secret war no one knows is being fought. I still work at the diner. I still drive the empty roads. But I am never truly alone, and the night is never truly dark. I am the man who knows what follows, what watches, what feeds. And sometimes, when I see a lone driver speeding through the deep night, eyes wide with a fear they think is their own, I send a silent, useless blessing their way because I know the truth. The road is hungry, and it has learned how to make us feed ourselves. The story never ends. It just finds new tellers. The road never ends. It simply changes its skin. Asphalt gives way to gravel, gravel to dirt, dirt to the faintest impression of a path where only the desperate or the doomed would think to tread. I know this now. My diner still smells of stale coffee and fried regret. My drives home still trace the same weary geometry under the stars. The machinery of an ordinary life continues its rotations, but the man operating it is a ghost in the system. I chose remembrance. In the silent calculus of that desert basin, I bargained for my pain and kept it. The whispers are gone, but the knowing is permanent. I see the world as it is, a placid surface stretched taut over a seething, shimmering substratum. The web is still there. On moonless nights, when the wind is just right, I can perceive its faint, phosphorescent threads running alongside the highway, thrumming with a low-grade energy. The thin places glow like rotten stars on my internal map. I feel their pull, a tide of ancient sorrow I've learned to navigate but never ignore. I am neither victim nor acolyte. I am the watchman in a tower everyone else believes is empty. I serve the last cold cups of coffee to men who speak of their troubles with bills and bosses, and I can see the faint, gossamer thread of anxiety connecting them to a deeper, darker current they'll never name. I see the tired trucker at the counter, and I can almost glimpse the predatory shadow that might be tailing him in the dimensional echo beside our own. I say nothing. To warn him would be to invite the web's attention, to become an active node. My role is observation. My curse is clarity. Sometimes on my drive, I'll pass a car pulled to the shoulder, a person standing outside looking lost or afraid under the dome light, and I'll see it. A subtle thickening of the air around them, a faint, hungry shimmer. The road is tasting their distress. I drive on. I always drive on. fear, and interference is forbidden by my own path. The greatest horror is not the monster. It is the understanding that the ecosystem of fear must be maintained, and that compassion can be the most dangerous fuel of all. I thought the truth would set me free. Didn't. It built a prison of silent knowing around me. But in this prison, there is a terrible kind of peace. The fear is gone, burned away in the desert sun, replaced by a resonant, unshakable melancholy. I am the guardian of a graveyard of secrets, a living tomb for a truth that would break the world if it were widely known. That we are not alone, we have never been alone, and the things that share our space are not interested in our hopes, our dreams, or our prayers. They are interested in one thing only: the unique, sparkling energy of a conscious mind in the moment it realizes it is prey. So I continue. The wheels turn, the road unfolds, the night deepens, and I watch. For all of us, the road stretches on, a silent black ribbon under a sky salted with indifferent stars. The engines fall silent, one by one. The headlights dim, their light swallowed by the same darkness they once pierced. The stories have been told, the terror shared, the secret passed like a cursed coin from my hand to yours. But listen, can you hear it? Not with your ears, but with that quiet, cold place that wakes in you at 3 a.m. It's the hum of tires on pavement that isn't there. The faint, rhythmic pulse of a light just outside your peripheral vision. The shape that moves in the tree line, keeping perfect pace with your passing car. This was never just a story about a bartender, a trucker, and a joyrider. It was a map, and you've just traced its lines with your own mind. You've felt the chill of the fog, the prickle of being watched, the jolt of the impossible impact. The hook is not in their flesh anymore. It is in the atmosphere. It is in the very idea of the lonely road. So tonight, or some night soon, when you find yourself driving late, when the world shrinks to the tunnel of your headlights and the empty seat beside you feels suddenly too large, remember, the phenomena are real. The web is real. It doesn't live in a specific forest or a certain desert wash. It lives in the condition of being alone in the dark, moving through space. It lives in the resonance between your solitude and the ancient hunger of the places you pass. You will look in your rearview mirror. You will question the shadow in the ditch. You will feel a cool, inexplicable dread when the last streetlight fades behind you. And in that moment, you will have a choice. You can dismiss it. You can crank the radio, cling to the rational, and hurry home to lock the door against the night. You can choose to be severed, or you can do what I did. You can slow down. You can roll the window down and let the dark air in. You can look directly into the shapeless gloom beside the road and, without speaking, you can simply acknowledge. I see you. The road is hungry, and it has learned how to make us feed ourselves. The story never ends. It just finds new tellers. Be careful where you drive. And remember, you were warned.